Today we'll be discussing innovative research on the long-term health of men who have histories of early trauma. More specifically, we'll focus on one childhood trauma, sexual abuse, and its relation to the mental health of men over 50 years of age. Using a lifespan approach, we'll address questions such as, what are the long-term effects of early traumas? How do survivors fare in their 50s, 60s, 70s, and beyond? Why do some survivors do better than others? And what can be done in terms of interventions to improve the health and well-being of older survivors? In this presentation, I'll first present background information to frame and inform our discussion. Then I'll share the results of 3 recent studies in my program of research. Finally, we'll conclude with directions for future research and practice. Let's start with background information. Not long ago, the sexual abuse of boys was thought to be a rare event. Since then, highly publicized scandals in mainstream U.S. institutions, Penn State University, the Boy Scouts of America, the U.S. Catholic Church, brought this issue into the living rooms of the general public and shed light on a stark reality. Epidemiological studies have since found it's anything but rare. Estimates vary due to measurement factors. Nonetheless, approximately 5% of boys worldwide experience penetrative sexual abuse, and the percentage for all forms of sexual violence is up to 3 times that rate. In fact, several studies have found a U.S. prevalence rate near 15%, or 1 in 6 boys. Despite the prevalence, male survivors remain an under-researched, stigmatized, and vulnerable population. Most of the research on sexual abuse has been conducted with female survivors. Although extremely valuable, we can't assume that the results automatically apply to male survivors. Also, most research to date has focused on short-term effects, that is, problems that many survivors face later in childhood and adolescence: depression, anxiety, delinquency, conduct disorders, substance use, impaired academic achievement, and others. But we know relatively little about the longer-term effects of child sexual abuse in early, middle, and late adulthood. These limitations are quite troubling. We need more knowledge on male survivors to improve clinical practice. Consider 3 examples that vividly illustrate how child sexual abuse can impair functioning for men aged 50 and older. A 62-year-old African-American male experienced panic attacks prior to his annual physical checkup, which usually included a prostate exam. Later, he confided to his therapist that he was a victim of penetrative sexual abuse as a child. A 55-year-old white male for many years enjoyed a successful career in investment banking, but then started drinking heavily and became depressed. This occurred around the time that his son turned 12 years old, the age that he himself was abused. And a 74-year-old Hispanic grandfather refused to attend his granddaughter's wedding in the town's Catholic Church. Later, he revealed to his wife that he was sexually assaulted by a priest as an altar boy, and walking into a church would simply be overwhelming. One of the reasons for this gap in our knowledge base is the historical gulf in academia between childhood and older adulthood. In social work, for example, some researchers study children, while others study gerontology, or older adults. Few connect these populations. The net result is knowledge silos. However, pioneering research in the last few years may reflect a change in approaching the health of older adults. Cutting-edge studies on ACEs, or adverse childhood experiences, illustrate lifelong effects. ACEs include forms of child abuse, but also environmental problems, witnessing domestic violence, family members with mental illness, or substance abuse problems. These ACEs have the potential to undermine many aspects of functioning. For example, a 2008 study by Draper and colleagues examined data from 21,000 participants over the age of 60. They found that those who were physically or sexually abused during childhood had a greater risk of poor physical and mental health later in life than non-abused participants. The researchers concluded, quote, "The effects of childhood abuse appear to last a lifetime, and that further research is required to improve understanding of the pathways to health outcomes and ways to minimize the effects of childhood adversity in late life." Other studies have found that child sexual abuse can impair men's functioning in adulthood in several domains: physical health, psychological health, social health, spiritual health, and general well-being. It's also related to mortality. Men who are sexually abused are up to 10 times more likely to have suicide ideation, and 4 to 11 times more likely to attempt suicide than non-abused men. These studies provide valuable information, but the knowledge base is still fledgling. One perplexing question that remains is, why do some male survivors suffer and struggle with their mental health across the lifespan, while others seemingly cope well? This question, along with several theories, has guided my program of research. Research on hidden populations such as male survivors is extremely difficult. To reach and recruit participants, we partnered with 3 national survivor organizations, the Survivors Network of Those Abused by Priests, Male Survivor, and 1in6.org. Approximately 500 men completed an anonymous online survey. In doing so, these men provided valuable information and helped build one of the largest data sets to date with this population. The sample consisted of men ranging in age from 18 to 84 years, with a mean of 50 years. It's one of the first studies to include young, middle-aged, and older adult survivors. Most of them were white, living with a spouse or partner, and members of a survivor organization. The average age that the men were first sexually abused was 10. Most participants were abused by someone that they knew, a priest, a teacher, a family member, and the sexual abuse on average lasted more than 1 year. With this data set in mind, let's consider 3 recently published studies. In the first study, the primary research question was, why do some male survivors experience long-term mental health problems and others do not? The purpose was to identify specific risk and protection factors related to mental distress, depression, anxiety, somatic symptoms, and suicidality. Based on the literature and relevant theories, we hypothesized that abuse severity variables would be related to mental health problems. That is, more severe abuse involving penetration, longer duration, incest, and physical force would predict higher levels of distress. Scholars have noted that sexual abuse doesn't occur in a vacuum. Often it occurs in the context of other household problems like violence, parental substance use, physical abuse. Based on the life course perspective, complex trauma theory, and previous research, we hypothesized that the number of adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs, would predict more distress in adulthood. An extremely important part of recovery is the disclosure process. Because keeping the secret of abuse can prevent survivors from accessing resources for recovery, we predicted that survivors who waited longer to tell someone would have more distress. We also expected that receiving a helpful response to disclosure, being believed, supported, that would be related to less distress. Last, there is growing knowledge about masculine norms in male socialization. Basically, boys and men who adhere to extreme masculine norms often experience more health problems. Thus, we predicted that male survivors who scored higher on a measure of masculine norms would have worse mental health. The results were fascinating. Of the 4 abuse severity variables, only one was significant, the use of physical force. All of the other predictions were supported by the results. Male survivors who took longer to disclose, received an unhelpful response, grew up in a problem-saturated household, and adhered to rigid masculine norms experienced more mental distress. Interestingly, age was negatively related to mental distress. Older participants had better mental health than younger ones. However, this is not to say that older survivors do not need clinical services, as they too had high levels of depression and other problems in this sample. For practice implications, clinical providers should include abuse severity and ACEs in assessments. We should also explore disclosure history and help survivors expand their support networks. Finally, we should assess masculine norms with survivors. Therapists can help them reevaluate rigid notions of masculinity and explore more flexible ways of dealing with emotions and problems. In the second study, we examined an emerging concept in the trauma literature, post-traumatic growth. In the aftermath of traumas such as war, natural disasters, or chronic illnesses, some survivors actually experienced positive changes, such as a greater appreciation of life, improved relations with others, or better understanding of themselves. Some survivors discover new strengths that they never knew they had, and others create meaning from the tragedies, which can facilitate recovery. Based on literature and theory, we predicted that 6 variables would be related to growth. If a survivor experienced a turning point in their recovery, received support following disclosure, gained an understanding of the effects of the sexual abuse on their lives, and were older, we anticipated more growth. Conversely, if a survivor was abused by a member of the clergy or held rigid masculine norms, we expected less growth. Of all the variables, only 3 were significant. Men who had experienced a turning point in their recovery reported more growth. Similar to the previous study, higher masculine norms were harmful and meant less growth for survivors. Men who had more understanding of the sexual abuse reported more growth. Rather than denying or avoiding the experience, thinking and processing the abuse was apparently helpful. These results suggest that there is great merit in processing the abuse with men, whether it's through formal therapy, survivor support groups, or even self-help books. Thinking about the meaning of the sexual abuse helps survivors heal and grow. In clinical work with survivors, therapists should also help them deconstruct hypermasculine beliefs that could be hindering growth. The third study was a qualitative project to hear the voices of the survivors themselves on an important topic: barriers to disclosure. Disclosing that one was sexually abused is a very difficult step. In this data set, the men waited, on average, 21 years before they ever told someone about the abuse. And they waited nearly 3 decades, or 28 years, before they had an in-depth conversation about the abuse. In fact, one 74-year-old participant confided that the survey was the first time that he told someone. That's a lot of time to bear the burden and keep the secret. But disclosing is critical to many survivors' recovery. It's often the first step in seeking help. And as we saw in the first study, waiting longer is related to more mental health problems. In this study, we asked participants why it's hard for men to disclose their abuse to others. The participants then provided a written, open-ended response. Our team spent nearly a year poring over and analyzing the data. As a result, we identified common types of barriers to disclosure that we organized into 3 broad categories: sociocultural, interpersonal, and personal. I'm going to read a few participant responses to illustrate some of these barriers. Participant 358 stated, "There are many reasons why men find it difficult to talk about their abuse and choose to never speak about it at all. Shame, guilt, doubt, denial, fear of not being believed, loved, or cared for, fear of being judged, abandoned, or alienated." Participant 73 eloquently wrote, "We are soldiers of an unpopular war, and no one wants to see us on parade. We remind them of something that makes them uncomfortable." In terms of practice implications, it's clear we need to provide more resources to assist male survivors. From rape crisis centers to graduate schools of social work, mental health providers need more information and training on how to effectively welcome, support, and treat men with histories of sexual abuse. Public media campaigns could help combat the stigma and shame and provide family members and spouses, partners, and friends with tips on how to provide an empathetic, supportive response to disclosure. These efforts are also needed to shine light on the darkness that so many of them have experienced for decades of keeping the secret. Although these studies illustrate progress being made in terms of understanding men's health, more work is needed. These 3 studies were limited by factors such as cross-sectional design and non-probability sampling. Moving forward, we need longitudinal studies that could explicate processes that unfold across the lifespan. They could also establish temporal ordering, a requirement for better models. Future studies should be based on nationally representative samples. This would improve our ability to generalize results. Those samples need to include minority participants in order to understand possible cultural differences. Finally, we need intervention research. A few models or theories of healing are emerging for male survivors. These models need to be tested in clinical work. These types of studies are essential to developing evidence-informed or evidence-based practice, the key to alleviating the suffering and promoting recovery for this population.